There's a red Jeep parked on a dark mountain road in Colorado, engine off, headlights dead, no other cars, no other movement, just the building ahead and the night around it, and one person deciding what to do next. The building is Mount Massive Asylum. The decision takes about as long as it takes to open a car door. He gets out. That moment, small as it seems, is the beginning of one of the strangest endings in survival horror, where the man who arrived with a camera to document what was being done to people inside that building becomes, by the time it's over, the most significant thing that ever happened to it, where the story consumes the person who came to tell it. But here's what most analysis of Outlast misses. The question isn't just what happened to Miles inside Mount Massive Asylum. The question is whether any of it could have been avoided, whether the forces that destroyed him were already converging before he touched the fence, whether his fate was sealed by accident or by a logic so precise it almost looks like design. This video is not a recap. It won't move scene by scene through the game summarizing what you already saw. What it will do is attempt to answer the question the lore never quite articulates directly. The question embedded in everything the game builds: was a freelance journalist doomed before he even arrived at that facility? Not just by bad luck, not just by being in the wrong place, but by something in him, something in Murkoff, something in what the asylum was already doing that night, and something in what the Walrider specifically needed from its next host. The answer involves institutional psychology, the specific damage that journalism does to certain kinds of people, the mechanics of how the morphogenic engine prepared human minds for possession, and a patient who had appointed himself prophet and was waiting for exactly the kind of man Miles was. By the end, you'll understand why the qualities that made him good at his job were the same qualities that made him the perfect vessel for something that had nothing to do with journalism. And that realization is a lot more uncomfortable than it sounds. This is original analytical commentary on the Outlast universe, thematic and interpretive, treating the lore as a lens for examining real patterns in how people, institutions, and the stories they carry interact in ways that can't be undone. If something in this video stays with you, something specific, a connection that clicks, or a detail that hits differently than you expected, drop it in a comment. This channel grows through those conversations. Some of the best future video ideas have come directly from you, and if there's a game you've been waiting for someone to dig into properly, put it there too. Now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1: The Man Who Shouldn't Have Gone. Consider what it means to be a freelance journalist. No editor to call, no institutional safety net, no legal team to consult if things go wrong. No one back at the office tracking your location, waiting for your check-in, prepared to escalate when the check-in doesn't come. Freelance work in investigative journalism is a specific kind of professional solitude. You carry the story yourself. You weigh the risk yourself. You decide, entirely on your own authority, whether the story is worth what it's going to cost you. Miles had been doing this work for some time by the night he drove to Mount Massive. The canon is careful not to specify exact timelines, but what it does establish is the shape of his professional history, and that shape is revealing. At some point before the events of the game, he worked for a larger journalism organization. The work ended because of material he produced regarding the situation in Afghanistan. The organization didn't like what he posted. He was fired, and then he kept going. That detail is the one worth holding on to, because the natural response to being fired for the content of your journalism is to modify the approach, to learn the lesson, to find work in a safer lane, or at minimum to understand that certain kinds of stories have certain kinds of professional costs, and to build that understanding into future decisions. Miles didn't modify anything. He went freelance, which in practice meant removing the last remaining institutional filters between his judgment and his actions. No one could tell him the story was too sensitive now. No one could pull it from the queue. No one could revise or suppress what he filed. The accountability structure that had cost him his job, the one that had intervened when his Afghan material crossed some line the organization had drawn, that structure no longer existed for him. He operated according to his own moral calculus. and his moral calculus told him to keep going. Research on investigative journalists who cover conflict, atrocity, and institutional wrongdoing consistently surfaces a specific profile. These are people whose professional identity and their sense of moral purpose are fused in a way that's unusual even in a field full of people with strong vocational commitments. The story isn't just a job to them. Telling the story feels like the thing they exist to do. And when that feeling of purpose reaches a sufficient intensity, the ability to assess personal risk accurately tends to degrade, not because the person becomes careless or stops thinking, but because the frame they're operating in doesn't assign personal safety the same weight that most risk calculations do. The frame says, if this story doesn't get told, people who are being harmed will continue to be harmed. If nobody goes in, nobody comes out with the evidence. If not me, then who? That's not irrationality. That's a specific kind of moral reasoning that has its own internal logic. The problem is that internal logic operates inside the person, and it doesn't interface cleanly with the external reality of what they're walking into. The frame makes the cost feel acceptable before the person has a complete picture of what the cost actually is. Miles had a tip. The tip came from someone who identified themselves only through a secure email address. Someone who had spent 2 weeks doing software consulting work at Murkoff Psychiatric Systems' Mount Massive facility, and had seen enough to feel compelled to reach out anonymously. The content of that message was sparse and urgent. Strange things were happening to patients inside the facility. Dream therapy was going too deep. People were being hurt. Murkoff was profiting. The situation needed to be exposed. That was the information Miles had when he put the printed tip on his passenger seat, loaded his camera with fresh batteries, and drove through the night. It is worth spending a moment on that passenger seat, not because the physical object is interesting in itself, but because of what it tells us about how Miles was operating. He printed the email. He brought it with him, physically, as documentation. He was already in journalist mode before the car door opened. He was already building the story, already treating what he was about to walk into as something that would need to be reconstructed for an audience afterward. That impulse, the documentation impulse, the instinct to record before experiencing, is one of the most defining things about Miles as a character. His notes inside the asylum make this clear. He writes with dark humor, with cynical precision, with the voice of someone who has decided that witnessing is more important than reacting. He cracks jokes in his journal about situations that would break most people's capacity for language entirely. The humor isn't detachment. It's the opposite. It's a coping strategy deployed by someone who feels too much and has learned to channel that feeling into the act of narration rather than letting it paralyze him. That character, the one who writes dark jokes in a notebook while being hunted through a psychiatric facility, is the same character who drives alone at night to a building most people would have driven away from faster than they arrived. The connection between these two things is more direct than it looks. The compulsion to document, to narrate, to make sense of horror through the structure of a story is not separate from the compulsion to go looking for the horror in the first place. They're expressions of the same underlying drive. You go because you need to know. You write because knowing isn't enough without the record. The camera is always running. The notebook is always open. The story is always more important than the safety of the person telling it. This is the first layer of what the doom argument looks like. It doesn't require anything supernatural. It doesn't require Murkoff to have known Miles's name before he arrived, or Father Martin to have received a divine vision, or the Walrider to have been reaching for him across the mountains. At this most basic level, Miles was doomed before he arrived, simply because of who he already was. The person who gets out of that Jeep and walks toward that building is a specific kind of person, shaped by a specific professional history, operating from a specific moral framework, and completely incapable of turning around. If the building had been a hospital where administrators were defrauding patients' families, he would have gone in. If the building had been a factory where workers were being exposed to dangerous materials without their knowledge, he would have gone in. The building was a psychiatric facility. where something categorically beyond the frame of normal investigative journalism was happening. And he went in anyway, because the frame he operated from didn't have a category for what Mount Massive actually was. His risk calibration was built for a world where the worst things people do to each other are still recognizably human. The Afghanistan material that cost him his job was about something human, however horrific. The Murkoff tip was about something human, however criminal. Nothing in his professional experience had equipped him to evaluate the risk of walking into a facility where a technology derived from Nazi research had successfully created a sentient swarm of nanites, currently running loose and killing people. And so his calculated assessment of the risk, built on every story he'd covered before, was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with his intelligence or his capability. He was wrong because the situation was simply outside the category of things his framework could accurately measure. That's tragedy in the Greek sense, not stupidity, not recklessness in the simple meaning of the word, a person acting reasonably with the tools and knowledge available to them and being destroyed anyway because the world they walked into exceeded the parameters of everything they knew. But there's a second layer, the one that makes this more than just tragedy. Even if Miles had known, in some general sense, that things had gone very badly wrong inside Mount Massive, the profile his choices paint suggests he might have gone anyway. The journalist who keeps working after being fired for covering Afghanistan is someone whose calculation around stories doesn't function the way most people's risk calculations function. For him, the magnitude of the story potentially adjusts the acceptable magnitude of the risk. A bigger story, a more serious situation, a greater number of people being harmed. These factors, for someone with his profile, might actually increase the pull toward the story, rather than activating the retreat response that would trigger in most people. He might not be the person who, told that things are worse than expected, decides to leave. He might be the person who decides that the worse it is, the more necessary it is to document. The canon doesn't give us direct access to his reasoning, but the pattern of his choices, available in his professional history and in the notes he writes while inside the asylum, paints a consistent picture. And that picture doesn't show a person who would have turned around if he'd known more. Which means the doom was already present in him, before Wayland Park sent the email, before anyone inside Mount Massive Asylum knew his name. The night he arrived, things inside the building had already exceeded any straightforward possibility of rescue for most of the people inside. The next chapter is about what was already happening while Miles was still driving. Chapter 2. The Building Already on Fire. If you reverse time and watched Mount Massive Asylum from the outside, during the weeks leading up to the events of Outlast, you would not see anything obviously wrong. That's the first thing to understand about Murkoff and the facility they operated there. The building looked like what it was supposed to look like. Psychiatric patients were admitted. Staff went in and out. The lights were on. The paperwork was filed. The operation had all the external characteristics of a functioning medical institution, which was precisely the point. Murkoff had acquired Mount Massive years before Miles arrived. The facility had been dormant for decades when they bought it, closed down and forgotten in the way that certain buildings in remote places simply accumulate silence over time. Murkoff reopened it under the appearance of psychiatric care. Patients came through official channels. The public-facing identity of the place was conventional enough to draw no particular scrutiny. Behind that face, the facility was running something that had nothing to do with psychiatric care. Project Walrider was the operational name for what Murkoff was actually doing at Mount Massive. The project was the culmination of research tracing its origins to Rudolf Gustav Wernicke, a German scientist whose early work had been conducted in conditions that no ethical framework would have permitted. That research had survived by being useful to entities powerful enough to protect it, moving through the hands of organizations that valued its potential highly enough to overlook the methods that produced it. By the time Murkoff was running it in Colorado, it had been refined across decades, but its fundamental foundation remained unchanged. The belief that human consciousness could be pushed to a specific breaking point, and that at that breaking point, It could be made to do something no one had managed to make it do before. The morphogenic engine was the tool that made this possible, or possible enough to be functional. The engine worked by subjecting patients to a process designed to bring them to the edge of complete psychological dissolution. The specifics of what the process involved are documented across the notes and documents scattered through the asylum, and they describe something that cannot be accurately characterized as therapy by any standard that word is supposed to carry. Patients placed in the engine experienced what the documentation calls lucid dream states, but calling them that understates what they actually were. These were engineered nightmares built from the specific content of each subject's psychology, calibrated to exploit every existing wound and amplify every existing terror, sustained for long enough that the mind's ability to distinguish between the nightmare and reality began to fail. The body, kept mostly intact through the process, could endure this for a remarkably long time. The mind, not intact in any meaningful sense, changed in ways that could not be reversed. The patients who survived the engine in functional form became variants. Their physical capacities were frequently altered, enhanced in brutal ways that had no connection to anything the original person had been. Their psychology was rearranged around whatever obsession, compulsion, or distorted imperative the engine had carved deepest into them. What remained was still human in the biological sense. In almost every other sense, what had made them the specific people they were had been destroyed. Most of the attempts to produce a viable Walrider host through this process had failed. The failures were not minor. They were catastrophic for the individuals subjected to them, and they were documented with the clinical detachment of people who had reclassified the subjects as experimental material rather than as human beings with claims on ordinary moral consideration. Murkoff's documentation of these failures reads like what it is: the records of an institution that had decided its research objectives outweighed any other consideration, including the suffering or death of the people it was using to pursue those objectives. Eventually, one patient succeeded where all others had not. William Hope was not at Mount Massive because he was mentally ill. He was there because his mother, in circumstances not fully explained in the canon, had given him to Murkoff in exchange for money, on the false premise that he suffered from a mental illness related to his military service. He had served in the army. He had not, at that point, manifested any genuine mental illness. Murkoff acquired him and put him through a process he had not consented to and could not have understood, and through that process he achieved what their research called lateral ascension. He became the Walrider's first host. The Walrider, through Billy's connection to it, escaped the underground lab. What follows in the timeline is reconstructed through fragments, but the structure is clear. The swarm began killing Murkoff's staff. The facility's ability to contain the situation deteriorated rapidly. The patients, variants and otherwise, broke free. Murkoff sent in tactical forces. The tactical forces found themselves fighting something they were not equipped to fight. All of this was already happening when Wayland Park sat down in a server room and typed an email. Park had been brought in as a contract software engineer. His technical work involved the morphogenic engine's systems, which meant he had more direct exposure to the reality of what Murkoff was doing than most outside contractors would have access to. He watched. He understood enough of what he saw to know that it was wrong, that it was serious, that it was the kind of thing that needed to be outside the walls of the facility and in front of people with the authority to stop it. The legal agreements he'd signed told him to stay silent. His conscience told him something else. He broke the agreements. He sent the email quickly, from a compromised connection, aware that he might be monitored. The email went to Miles. What Park sent was not a complete account of what was happening at Mount Massive. It couldn't have been, because Park himself didn't understand what was happening at Mount Massive. He understood that patients were being hurt. He understood that Murkoff was profiting from something that would qualify as criminal under any reasonable legal standard. He didn't have the language or the framework for what the Walrider was, what the engine had actually achieved, what was happening to the people being put through it. His email described a level of wrongdoing that was genuinely serious. It described a situation that probably warranted investigation by authorities with real power and resources. It didn't describe anything that would have prepared Miles for what he was walking into. He had information that was accurate as far as it went, provided by someone acting in good conscience with the information they had available. The information was simply insufficient to describe what was actually happening, and he arrived at a building that was not simply a place where criminals had committed crimes. He arrived at a building where the laws of ordinary human experience had already been altered in ways that no investigative framework could have anticipated or navigated. This is the second layer of the doom argument, and it compounds the first rather than replacing it. If the first layer says Miles was doomed because of who he already was, the second layer says he was doomed because of what he was walking into, and the specific way those two things interacted, because the gap between what he expected and what was real inside Mount Massive was not simply a matter of degree, it was a gap in kind. Expecting a story about institutional abuse and finding an active supernatural event are not the same category of experience. The adjustment required to shift from one frame to the other is so significant that it's not clear a single person, alone and without support, in real time under active threat, could have made that adjustment successfully. He didn't have time to make it. The adjustment was supposed to happen inside a building full of people who were already beyond saving, already transformed, already operating according to imperatives that had nothing to do with the normal social contract Miles had grown up inside. But there's something else about the state of the building the night Miles arrived, something that matters specifically for the question of whether he was doomed, that goes beyond the fact that it was dangerous. The building was already organized, partially, around him, not consciously, not in the sense that anyone inside had known his name or planned for his specific arrival, but in the sense that the forces operating inside Mount Massive that night had already arranged themselves into something that would receive him in a very specific way. One of those forces was still running the morphogenic engine's influence across the variant population that now controlled most of the facility. Another of those forces had decided, from inside a theology of his own construction, that what the Walrider needed was an apostle, someone to witness the birth of a new God, someone to carry the gospel out. That force had been looking for that person, and the moment Miles came through the wall and hit the floor of the atrium, that force found him. The man who would call himself Father Martin had been waiting, and what he decided in that first moment of encounter would reshape everything Miles experienced for the rest of the night. But before we get to Martin, we need to spend time with the person who tried, however violently, to stop what was going to happen to Miles. Because the first person in the asylum who understood that Miles was in specific danger and who tried to act on that understanding was also the first person to nearly kill him. Chapter 3: Little Pig. The first time Chris Walker saw Miles, he picked him up and threw him through a window. No warning, no negotiation, no pause to assess what kind of person this was or what they were doing here. The encounter was approximately 2 seconds from first contact to catastrophe, with Miles dropping 20 feet and hitting the floor below with the kind of impact that should have ended the night immediately. The fact that it didn't, the fact that he was still breathing, still capable of getting up, still running the camera, that's what the game presents as almost incidental, a physical resilience that the narrative doesn't explain and doesn't particularly need to. What it does need to explain is Walker, and Walker is one of the most instructive characters in the Outlast universe for understanding what the morphogenic engine actually did to people, and why what it did to people is directly relevant to the question of what it was going to do to Miles. Before admission to Mount Massive, Chris Walker had been a military police officer. He had served multiple tours. The specific conflicts aren't all named in the documents, but Afghanistan figures in his history, which creates one of the quietly unsettling echoes of the lore. Miles was fired for material about Afghanistan. Walker was a veteran of it. Their histories, without any overlap, touched the same geography of a particular kind of horror before either of them arrived in Colorado. What Walker was admitted to the asylum for isn't spelled out completely. What the documents establish is the shape of what happened to him there. The engine processed him in the way it processed everyone. It found the deepest grooves in his psychology and carved them wider. For Walker, those grooves ran through the language of security protocol. His pre-existing professional identity had been organized around containment, around maintaining order, around ensuring that things which should not get out did not get out. The engine amplified that framework to the point of complete psychological domination. His fixation, as documented by whoever at the facility was still filing clinical notes before the collapse, is described as a manic exaggeration of military security protocol. The fixation expressed itself physically. He removed flesh from his forehead, claiming it allowed for a truer kind of vision. He removed his own nose and lips, behaviors attributed to extreme anxiety. He became something that was still visibly organized around a mission, but organized in a way that bore only a grotesque resemblance to anything the original mission had been. And his mission, by the time Mount Massive had collapsed around him, was containment of the most specific and terrible kind. He understood, in whatever way his fractured mind could still understand anything, that the Walrider needed a host to anchor itself. He understood that hosts were not random. He understood that the process that created hosts involved exposure to extreme psychological states, which meant that almost anyone who had been inside the facility for any length of time during the collapse was potentially usable. So his response to that understanding was to eliminate every potential host. Every person he encountered, staff or patient, became a potential host to be neutralized. The headless bodies found throughout the facility are the record of his containment effort. Think about the logic of that for a moment. Walker had arrived at the same conclusion that the Walrider's own research had been driving toward, from the opposite direction. Murkoff wanted to produce and control a host. Walker wanted to ensure no host existed. Both of them had correctly identified that the host was the critical variable. Where their conclusions differed was in what to do about it. Walker's approach was direct, absolute, and completely unworkable given the scale of what had already happened. He was trying to drain a flooding building one bucket at a time, but within the constraints of his ruined psychology, it was the only logic he had access to. When he grabbed Miles and threw him through that window, his intention was probably consistent with everything else he was doing. Another potential host dealt with, except Miles didn't die. This is where the interaction between characters in the Outlast lore becomes structurally interesting, in a way the game doesn't make explicit but the lore supports when you arrange the events in order. Walker's attack on Miles, which was an attempt to prevent Miles from becoming a host, had the immediate effect of putting Miles in the specific location where Father Martin could find him. Martin was waiting in the prison block. Miles came through the window and landed in front of him. The meeting that Martin had apparently been anticipating, in some theological framework operating entirely inside his own head, happened because Walker intervened. The intervention designed to stop one outcome triggered the chain of events that produced that exact outcome. That's not irony for its own sake. It's a structural feature of how Doom operates in the Outlast universe. The attempts to prevent the thing and the thing itself aren't separate trajectories. They feed each other. Walker trying to contain the Walrider by eliminating hosts created a body count that intensified the psychological environment inside the Asylum, which intensified the conditions that made the Walrider more dangerous, which accelerated the timeline toward a new host being needed. The containment effort was simultaneously fueling what it was trying to contain. Miles, thrown through a window and surviving, landed in the middle of that loop. The second significant Walker encounter happens near the end of Miles's journey, in the underground lab. By that point, Miles had traveled through most of the facility, had experienced a catalog of horrors that would have destroyed most people's capacity to keep functioning, and had been guided by Martin's theology and the Asylum's own terrible architecture toward the chamber where Billy Hope was kept alive and tethered to the Walrider. Walker found him there, cornered him, and had him pinned to the floor with enough force to suggest that this time there would be no surviving. Then the Walrider killed Walker, the entity that Walker had spent his entire time in the facility trying to prevent from finding a new host, killed him in the moment when he was closest to succeeding. The Walrider's swarm took Walker apart, in a way that the game documents without lingering on the specifics. What the moment means is more important than what it looked like, because Walker's death in that instant cleared the last physical obstacle between Miles and Billy Hope's life support. It cleared the path to the confrontation that would produce a new host. It completed, with violent finality, the trajectory that Walker's own intervention had set in motion when he first grabbed Miles in the atrium. Walker tried, in the way his broken mind permitted, to stop what was going to happen to Miles. He failed twice and succeeded at nothing. But both failures moved the narrative forward in the direction of the thing he was trying to prevent. There's a real-world parallel worth drawing here, and it doesn't require any medical expertise to see. Research on institutional responses to perceived threats consistently shows that aggressive containment strategies applied to complex, distributed problems tend to accelerate those problems rather than resolve them. When the response to systemic failure is elimination of individuals rather than restructuring of systems, the failure continues under new conditions. Walker was doing the individual elimination response to a systemic failure. Murkoff had been doing the same thing for years, committing anyone who knew too much to the very engine that produced the problem they were trying to conceal. The entire organism of Mount Massive Asylum was running this same logic. Miles was the latest iteration. He arrived as a potential complication and was immediately processed by the facility's existing machinery into something else entirely. Understanding Walker is necessary for understanding why Miles's journey through the asylum went the way it did. Walker was the first gate. He opened it by slamming it shut on Miles and missing. Every subsequent gate, Martin's theology, Trager's operating theater, the underground lab, Billy's life support, was waiting on the other side of that first window. And the man who found Miles at the bottom of the fall was already certain he'd been waiting for him. But before we get to Martin's theology, there's something worth sitting with in the Walker section of the lore that speaks directly to the spine of this analysis. Walker recognized that Miles could potentially become a host. He acted on that recognition with violence. His violence was both wrong about the method and right about the outcome. Miles did become a host, and the question that opens from that is, what was it about Miles that made Walker correct? The answer isn't random chance. The answer is in what the Walrider actually required, and why someone with Miles's history and psychology, far from being an unlikely candidate, was almost precisely suited for it. That argument builds slowly across the rest of this analysis, but the first thread of it is already visible here, in the moment Walker threw him and didn't kill him. He threw someone he recognized as a host. He failed to kill that person, and the logic of the asylum took it from there. Chapter 4: The Apostle and the Prophet. There's a specific kind of theology that emerges inside total institutions when the people inside them lose access to any other framework for making sense of what's happening to them. A total institution is a term from sociology for a place that controls every aspect of its residents' lives: what they eat, when they sleep, how they're allowed to think about themselves, what information they have access to, how they understand the world outside. Prisons are total institutions. Certain military organizations are total institutions. Psychiatric facilities, historically, have frequently functioned as total institutions for their patients. The defining feature is not just confinement, but the replacement of the outside world's frameworks with frameworks produced by the institution itself. Mount Massive Asylum was not simply a total institution. It was a total institution that had been conducting systematic psychological destruction on its population, and that had, by the night Miles arrived, collapsed into a state of violent chaos in which the normal institutional controls were gone, but the damage they had produced remained. The variants roaming the corridors were the patients that the institution had made. Their behaviors, their obsessions, their particular forms of broken cognition were the institution's product. Into that environment, before Murkoff fully lost control, had emerged something that sometimes happens when total institutions push people to their psychological limits: a religion. The documents describing what would become Father Martin's theology suggest it developed in stages. A patient referred to in clinical notes with cautious quotation marks around father had begun to suffer from delusions of a higher calling after the asylum's art therapy program was discontinued. The quotation marks matter. They tell us that whoever was documenting his case did not believe he was actually a priest. The cross he wore, fashioned from straps and restraint belts rather than any conventional material, supports this reading. Whatever his actual history before Mount Massive, the identity he had organized around inside the facility was constructed rather than continuous with anything that had come before. His religion worshipped the Walrider. The logic of that choice, if logic is even the right word, is worth examining carefully. Because Martin didn't simply decide to worship the most powerful thing in the facility, he built a genuine theological framework around the Walrider as a divine entity, with himself as its prophet, with the emergence of the Walrider as the event that would release him and his followers from the prison of the institution. The cross improvised from restraint materials is the key image here. The very tools of his confinement became the symbol of his faith. The asylum that had destroyed him became the temple from which his God would emerge. Research on how people construct meaning inside systems that are actively harming them reveals a consistent pattern. When suffering becomes extreme and inescapable enough, the cognitive pressure to find meaning in it becomes correspondingly extreme. The mind that cannot escape the suffering will often attempt to reframe the suffering as purposeful. What was done to you becomes not a crime, but a preparation. The people who harmed you become not perpetrators, but instruments. The experience of total helplessness becomes transformed, in the framework of the meaning system, into a kind of chosen suffering. Martin had done this with complete fidelity to the logic. The morphogenic engine had done terrible things to him. His mind had responded by finding a framework in which those things were sacred. The Walrider, the entity produced by the engine's most extreme experiments, was the center of that framework. Its emergence was the revelation. Its power was the demonstration that his God was real, and he needed a witness. This is the theological requirement that explains why Martin reacted the way he did when Miles came through the window. His gospel required someone to carry it. A prophet without an apostle cannot spread the word. Martin was not going to be leaving Mount Massive alive, and some part of his theology had already accounted for this. His own death was written into the framework. The prophet's sacrifice would release the Walrider from its earthly tether and unleash it upon the world. But the sacrifice needed an audience. The audience needed to survive and carry what they had seen. The moment Miles landed in the atrium, Martin had his apostle. The speed and certainty of that identification matters. Martin didn't evaluate several options. He didn't hesitate. He looked at Miles and immediately knew, from within his own framework, that this was the person his theology required. The encounter reads, from the outside, as the delusional certainty of a man whose mind had been systematically broken by the same technology that had created his God. But from inside the Outlast lore, there's another way to read it. Martin may have been delusional. His theology was certainly not a reliable guide to empirical reality, but his identification of Miles as the specific person who could serve the role his gospel required was, in retrospect, strikingly accurate, because what Martin's gospel required from an apostle was not just a warm body. It required someone who would witness everything, someone who would keep going even when every instinct pointed toward stopping, someone who would document the horror rather than flee from it, someone whose compulsion to bear witness was stronger than their survival instinct, someone who, when presented with a choice between carrying the camera and putting it down, would choose the camera every time. Martin needed a journalist. Specifically, he needed this journalist. The specific kind of person that Miles's professional history and psychological profile had made him was exactly the kind of person Martin's theological framework required. The asylum, in this reading, didn't just receive Miles when he arrived. It recognized him. Martin's interventions across the night are worth examining in sequence, because what they add up to is a systematic campaign to prevent Miles from escaping, and to ensure he witnessed the specific sequence of events that Martin's theology required him to witness. They were orchestrated. by someone whose access to what remained of his strategic intelligence was filtered through theological certainty, but who was nonetheless effective in deploying that intelligence toward his goal. He cut the power to the security control room when Miles was attempting to use it to unlock the main exit. The power cut forced Miles deeper into the facility rather than out of it. When Miles restored the power and returned, Martin was waiting with a sedative. The sedative was not lethal. It was precisely calibrated to relocate Miles to a part of the facility further along the path Martin needed him to walk. He then left a message for Miles about accepting the gospel, about all doors opening before him. Before Miles lost consciousness from the sedative, Martin showed him footage on a security monitor. The footage was of the Walrider killing Murkoff tactical forces in the underground corridors. This was not accidental. Martin was doing something with that footage that functions almost as a priming mechanism. He was making sure that whatever Miles experienced next, he had already seen evidence of what was at the end of the path. He was making Miles a witness to the Walrider before Miles had encountered it directly. There is a psychological concept called preparatory exposure, the use of information about a threatening situation to reduce the shock response when the situation is actually encountered, which allows for more functional behavior during the encounter itself. Martin was, perhaps without fully understanding it in clinical terms, using the footage to prepare Miles to function inside the underground lab rather than simply collapse when he got there. Miles woke up in the prison block. The night continued. Martin appeared at intervals, leaving guidance, providing passage through areas where his followers among the variants gave Miles safe transit, moving pieces into position. He was not simply a religious fanatic roaming corridors. He was managing a series of events toward a specific outcome that his theology demanded. The sequence reached its climax in the chapel of the administration block. Martin had himself crucified. The ceremony had been planned in advance. Documents found in the asylum describe the ritual, written by believers inside Martin's microcult, treating his self-sacrifice as the culminating act of the faith. He asked Miles to record his death. Miles was there with the camera, the apostle performing the function the theology required of him, documenting what he had been guided toward this entire night. Then Martin burned. What Martin believed would happen when he died was that the Walrider would be released, that it would come to his aid or be set free by his sacrifice, that some form of resurrection awaited him through the entity he had worshipped. Whether any of that framework connected to anything that was actually real in the Outlast universe is left deliberately ambiguous. What is clear is that his death did nothing to rescue him in the way he expected. What is also clear is that his entire plan for Miles had worked. Miles was now in a position, having seen the footage, having navigated through the asylum on the path Martin laid for him, having recorded Martin's death as the apostle's function demanded, to move toward the underground lab. Martin guided Miles to within reach of the thing that would remake him. And then Martin died, leaving Miles to walk the last distance alone. There's something worth sitting with in Martin's role as the architect of Miles's path through the asylum, because in the framing of his theology, Martin genuinely believed he was offering Miles something, not just conscripting him. In his framework, he was giving Miles purpose. He was telling a man with a camera that the camera was sacred, that what he was recording mattered, that his function as a witness had cosmic significance for a person like Miles, whose professional identity was built on the belief that what you documented mattered, that the record was important, that the act of witnessing was its own form of service. This framing, even delivered by someone whose mind had been destroyed by Murkoff's experiments, might have resonated in ways that more conventional threats did not. Martin didn't try to stop Miles or hurt him in the way Walker did. He tried to redirect him, to give him a role inside a story bigger than the one he'd arrived to tell. He gave Miles compulsion to document a sacred object and called it destiny. Whether Miles consciously accepted any part of that framework is something the game wisely doesn't answer. His notes suggest irony and skepticism, but his feet kept moving forward, his camera kept running. Every time Martin gave him a door, he walked through it. The apostle performed the apostle's function, whether he understood himself that way or not. The distinction between accepting a role and simply being moved into position for it is where the doom argument finds its sharpest edge. Miles didn't choose to be Martin's apostle any more than Walker chose to be the mechanism that delivered him to Martin. But both of them performed their functions precisely. The machinery of that night required specific things from specific people, and each of them, for reasons rooted in who they already were, provided exactly what was required. Martin is the most visible example of this, but Martin's theology itself requires examination, because the God at the center of it, the thing Martin had built his entire meaning system around, was not a metaphor, it was a technology. And understanding what that technology did to the people it touched is essential to understanding why Miles, specifically, was capable of becoming its next host. That's where the next chapter goes. But before we get there, hold on to this specific tension. Martin was right about Miles in one sense, and catastrophically wrong in another. He was right that Miles would witness everything, document everything, keep moving through the dark when every survival instinct said to stop. He was wrong about what that witnessing would produce. He believed the apostle would carry the gospel outward and tell the world about the Walrider's birth. Miles didn't get to tell anyone anything. The story he was sent to cover became the thing that consumed him, and the Walrider that Martin had worshipped as a god chose his apostle as its vessel. Martin's theology, despite being the product of a destroyed mind in a collapsed institution, was accurate about the man, inaccurate about everything else. And that gap between the accuracy and the error is where Miles's particular brand of doom fully reveals itself. Chapter 5. What Bearing Witness Costs. There's a note Miles writes inside the asylum, somewhere in the wreckage of the administration block, that has been described as darkly funny by people who have replayed the game enough times to notice the writing rather than just survive the next encounter. His journal entries throughout the facility have this quality consistently, a wry, almost journalistic distance from what should be completely shattering material. He comments on what he sees with the precision of someone who has not stopped doing his job despite everything that has happened to him. He writes like a reporter. He always writes like a reporter. Most people read this as character, an aspect of Miles's personality, his baseline voice, the way someone trained to narrate experience processes the experience of being hunted through a psychiatric facility. And that reading is correct as far as it goes. What it doesn't account for is the mechanism underneath, because the behavior of documenting, narrating, writing notes while inside an active catastrophe isn't just a personality trait, it's a psychological strategy. And understanding what it costs the person using it is essential to understanding what the asylum was doing to Miles, even before any supernatural element had touched him directly. Journalism that covers atrocity, conflict, and institutional violence produces a specific category of psychological injury in the people who do it. The research literature on this goes back decades and has been refined across numerous studies of war correspondents, disaster reporters, and investigators who cover crimes against populations. The specific mechanism is called secondary traumatic stress, and it functions by a route that's distinct from how most people understand trauma to operate. In ordinary traumatic injury, the person is themselves the direct target of the overwhelming event. The threat is personal and immediate. The nervous system responds to direct danger. In secondary traumatic stress, the journalist is not directly targeted by the event they're documenting. They're the witness. But the act of witnessing, especially when sustained across multiple events over an extended period, produces neurological effects that closely parallel direct trauma. The brain processes observed horror through many of the same pathways it would use for experienced horror. The boundary between being present and being targeted is not as clean as professional training implies. The particular cruelty of this dynamic is that the training given to journalists who cover this kind of material, the training that says, stay objective, stay outside the frame, remain the observer rather than the participant, is itself a double-edged tool. The professional distance helps the journalist function. At the same time, the act of maintaining that distance while staying present, while not fleeing, while keeping the camera rolling or the notebook open through material that would trigger immediate flight in most people, requires sustained suppression of the self-protective responses that trauma naturally produces. The suppression works. It allows the journalist to do the job. Over time and accumulation, though, it costs something that doesn't come back easily. Miles had been doing this work, in one form or another, for long enough to have been fired from one job for the material he produced. The Afghanistan material that ended his institutional employment was, by implication, something that the organization deemed too extreme, too direct, too unflinching in its representation of whatever had happened there. The organization had a threshold. Miles had crossed it. That crossing tells us something about where his own threshold sat relative to professional norms. His threshold was further out. The notes he writes inside the asylum are evidence of what that extended threshold looks like in action. He's been thrown through a window. He's been sedated and relocated. He's moving through corridors full of the consequences of things that should not be happening to human beings. And he's taking notes, not fragmented shock response notes, coherent, observational, voice-consistent notes. Notes that sound like the same person who loaded his camera with batteries and drove through the night. The cognitive continuity across those experiences is, from a psychological standpoint, remarkable, and it is built on exactly the kind of trained suppression that makes secondary traumatic stress accumulate quietly underneath the professional surface without visible interruption to the output. What secondary traumatic stress eventually produces, when sustained long enough and at sufficient intensity, is a specific alteration in how the mind relates to horror. The exposure tolerance rises. Events that would initially have produced overwhelming neurological responses begin to be processed within a framework that has, through repeated exposure, developed structures for containing them. The person can keep functioning. The cost is that the distance between ordinary emotional experience and extreme experience starts to narrow in both directions. The person finds it harder to come fully down from the elevated states that sustained exposure requires. They find it harder to achieve the ordinary safety of people who haven't been doing this work. Over time, the person who has been bearing witness to atrocity becomes someone whose baseline neurological state has been shifted by the accumulated weight of what they've witnessed. Not broken, in the clinical sense that would prevent functioning, but changed, calibrated for a different register of experience than most people operate in. Now consider what the Walrider required from a host. The documentation of Project Walrider, assembled across the notes inside the asylum, makes clear that not just anyone could become a host. The process was specific. The engine existed precisely because random minds couldn't host the swarm. What was needed was a mind that had been pushed to particular extremities of psychological experience. A mind that had been brought into contact with the kind of horror that ordinary existence doesn't produce. A mind that had developed, through that contact, a relationship with extreme psychological states that differed from baseline human experience. The engine was built to manufacture that kind of mind through deliberate, engineered, sustained exposure to calibrated nightmares. Miles had been developing that kind of mind, gradually, through his professional life. Not through the same mechanism, not through the same degree of intensity, not with the specific technical direction of a process that was actively building toward Walrider compatibility, but in the general direction of the same outcome. The asylum, when Miles walked into it, did not encounter a blank slate. It encountered someone who had already been altered by his own history, someone whose trained suppression of self-protective responses, whose compulsion to document rather than flee, had already moved him in the direction of a mind capable of holding things that most minds would shatter under. The morphogenic engine was not the only route to a host. It was the controlled, deliberate, technically precise route. Miles was the natural, uncontrolled, experiential route to something functionally similar. This is the twist that almost no analysis of Outlast addresses directly. The conversation about Miles's fate tends to focus on what happened to him inside the facility, the encounters, the sedation, the violence, the final confrontation in the underground lab. It tends to treat the night as the cause and his transformation as the effect. But if the argument above holds, the cause was already partially present before the night began. The night compressed and accelerated a process that his years of journalism had already started. And here's what that means for the question this video is actually asking. If Miles was already, through the accumulation of his professional life, developing the kind of mind the Walrider could use, then his doom wasn't simply situational. It wasn't just that he happened to be in the wrong building on the wrong night. His doom was in him, building slowly, produced by the very act of doing the thing he believed mattered most. Every story that required him to witness horror had been quietly preparing him for the role he couldn't have known was coming. That's not comfortable, and the discomfort isn't abstract, because the logic extends beyond Miles and beyond horror games, and the extension is where it lands on something real. The people who do the necessary work of bearing witness to things society needs documented, who cover disasters and atrocities and institutional violence and bring that material back out for public understanding. Those people are changed by the work. The work changes them in the direction of being able to keep doing it. And the ability to keep doing it is built on exactly the kind of altered relationship with extreme experience that, in the Outlast universe, made Miles capable of hosting the Walrider. The capacity to do the work is inseparable from the cost of the work. The professional tool and the personal wound are the same thing with different names. If you're still following this at this depth, what comes next is the part of the analysis that shifts the frame completely. We've established who Miles was before the building, and what the building was already doing before he arrived. The next two chapters are about what the building did to him specifically, through two encounters that shaped everything that came after, in ways the game shows without explaining. The first is the man who turned Miles's body into a story about the price of knowledge. The second is the machinery that turned the entire asylum into a question about what a mind is for. Neither chapter ends where you'd expect it to. Chapter 6. The Surgeon's Theater. Richard Trager's operating room was a bathroom, a converted hospital bathroom on the upper floor of the male ward, fitted with a makeshift surgical setup that included a wheelchair for restraint purposes and a pair of industrial bone shears. The conditions were not sterile. The lighting was inadequate. The medical logic of the procedures performed there was not connected to any recognized practice of medicine. None of this mattered to Trager. The incongruity between the precision of his professional language and the chaos of his actual environment was one of the defining features of the encounter. He spoke like a colleague. He used the language of collaborative effort, of shared goals, of being on the same team. He discussed philosophy while preparing instruments. He engaged with ideas about faith and commerce and what money represents in a world that has moved past older forms of meaning. And then he cut off two of Miles's fingers with the stated intention of selling them. Before getting to what that moment means, the background matters, specifically what Trager was before the morphogenic engine touched him. He had been an executive at Murkoff, not a scientist, not a medical professional by training, but a head of finance for Murkoff, someone embedded in the financial and administrative wing of the corporation. His professional world was the intersection of experimental ambition and institutional management. He understood Murkoff's research not as a scientist understands it, but as someone who organized around it, who allocated resources toward it, who understood its value in terms that institutional structures recognize. His friendship with Jeremy Blaire, the documents confirm, extended to golf and the ordinary social fabric of corporate life. These were people who interacted in the language of professional camaraderie, who organized their relationships around shared investment in an institutional mission. That mission was what the engine was working toward, and Trager, in his executive capacity, had been proximate enough to the engine's research to develop what the records describe as an escalating interest in the physiology of the affected patients. He performed, on his own authority, live vivisection and exploratory surgeries on variants, seeking to understand what the engine's process was producing at a biological level. This was not an authorized extension of his role. It was a personal project run alongside his official functions. driven by something that had begun as professional curiosity and had apparently crossed into something less clinically defensible. When mitigation officers investigated an HR complaint at the facility before the events of the game, they found Trager functioning but displaying behavior that the investigation's notes treat as concerning. He was jovial, performatively cooperative, describing himself in terms of being a team player. He also harassed one of the investigators. The picture is of someone who had learned to use professional charm as a surface, while something considerably more predatory operated underneath. The morphogenic engine eventually found him. The canon doesn't specify the exact sequence of events that led to Trager being committed as a patient, but the logic of Murkoff's institutional behavior is consistent. When someone inside the corporation became a liability, a potential exposure risk, or simply inconvenient to the project's continuation, the asylum was the destination. Trager knew too much about what was being done at the facility to be simply fired. The same logic that had turned worried patients and inconvenient witnesses into variants applied to him. What the engine made of Trager was a function of what Trager already was. The engine didn't invent his sadism. It didn't install a new personality. What the research suggests it does is find the deepest existing patterns in a person's psychology and amplify those patterns beyond any remaining social constraint. For Walker, the pattern was security and containment. For Trager, the pattern was the predatory professional interest in the bodies of others that he had been pursuing long before the engine touched him, now stripped of every institutional pretense and operating in its pure form. The pretense of medicine remained. That's the detail that makes Trager so specifically disturbing. He still spoke the language of the profession. He still performed the rituals of medical care, hand washing, patient assessment, the narrative framing of procedure as help, but the content had been evacuated. What was left was the form of medicine applied to the pure expression of his actual interest, which was human bodies as material to understand and exploit. Miles, restrained in the wheelchair in Trager's converted bathroom, was the patient. 2 fingers were removed, bone shears without anesthetic. The camera on the sink in front of him, still running. Miles's first-person perspective means the game doesn't editorialize on this moment, but the notes he writes afterward, and the way he writes them, tell us something about what it cost him. The dark humor is still there. The journalist voice is still functional. He is still observing, still narrating, still doing the work of documentation, even in the immediate aftermath of being physically mutilated. But something shifted. The character who climbed the fence a few hours earlier, and the character writing notes about missing fingers, are not experiencing the same relationship with his own body. Physical mutilation by a stranger in a converted bathroom while restrained is not an event that the mind processes and files without consequence. The research on physical trauma in high-stress environments is consistent about this. The body's integrity is a foundational element of psychological coherence, and deliberate destruction of that integrity produces effects that don't stay in the moment. They distribute forward. They change what subsequent experiences feel like, what the body's signals mean, how the relationship between self and environment registers. Miles kept going. That needs to be stated simply and clearly. He kept going. He escaped the restraints. He navigated the male ward while avoiding Trager. He found the elevator key. He used the elevator. He survived the final confrontation when Trager jumped aboard the elevator cab and was caught and killed by the mechanism Miles had set in motion to escape. The mechanics of that escape, specifically the moment where Miles pushed Trager out of the elevator and the descent did the rest, reflect something about Miles's approach throughout the facility. He doesn't fight in the conventional sense. He creates conditions and moves through them. He finds leverage points and applies pressure and lets the situation's own momentum carry the outcome. This is not a fighter's strategy. It's a journalist's strategy, an observer's strategy, a person who has spent professional years understanding that the most effective thing they can do is often to position themselves correctly and let events unfold. That strategy, effective in investigative journalism and surprisingly effective in survival situations, is also a symptom of the same psychological orientation that made Miles who he was. He documents and he navigates. He witnesses and he moves. The camera runs and the feet keep moving and the pen keeps writing. He doesn't stop. The Trager encounter is, in retrospect, the clearest illustration in the game of what Murkoff's institutional logic does when it turns completely on itself. Trager was a product of the same system that now had Miles in a wheelchair. He was what happened when someone with pre-existing predatory tendencies was given institutional power, access to vulnerable people, and a research environment that rewarded exactly the kind of exploitative curiosity he already possessed. Murkoff had not made Trager dangerous. Murkoff had found him useful and given him a framework within which his danger was productive for the institution. When the engine touched him, it simply removed the framework and left the danger. The institutional critique here is quiet but persistent across the Outlast lore. The Asylum was not corrupted by unusual individuals. The Asylum attracted and retained individuals whose pre-existing psychology was useful to the project, then processed them through a technology that stripped the institutional veneer and exposed the nature underneath. Trager wasn't an aberration inside Murkoff. He was its logic extended to completion. Miles, sitting in that wheelchair, was encountering the end product of exactly the kind of institutional wrongdoing he'd driven through the night to document. The story he'd come to tell was performing itself on his own body. The researcher who treats patients as experimental material had a new patient. And here's what makes the Trager chapter of the Doom argument specific rather than general. Miles survived. He escaped. He kept going. The mutilation didn't stop him, and the horror of that specific encounter didn't produce the kind of psychological collapse that might have been expected to follow it. His notes afterward are coherent. His documentary function is intact. His feet continue to move in the direction of the story. Research on acute stress responses in environments involving sustained threat, physical injury, and no available escape route shows that the population of people who maintain functional coherence across those conditions is not distributed randomly. The people who keep functioning are not necessarily the most physically capable or the most conventionally courageous. They tend to be people who have a strongly organized sense of purpose, people whose identity is anchored to a function rather than to a set of outcomes, people for whom doing the thing they do is more fundamental than the specific circumstances in which they're doing it. A journalist who believes that documenting matters, that the record is the point, that bearing witness is the function regardless of what is witnessed, has that kind of purpose anchor. It doesn't make the horror less terrible. It doesn't make the physical injury less real. It provides a frame that allows continued functioning when the situation provides no external resources to anchor survival behavior. Miles's resilience across the Trager encounter is therefore not simply remarkable in a generic sense. It's consistent with the specific psychology that his professional history had produced. He kept going because keeping going was what he did, had always done, would have done regardless of which building he was in. The wound he carried out of Trager's bathroom was real. The mission it didn't stop was also real. And the thing the mission was leading him toward, in the underground level below the male ward and the chapel and every ruined corridor he had survived, was the specific mechanism that had produced Trager and Walker and every variant currently loose in the building. What the morphogenic engine actually was, what it had been designed to do, and what Miles's accumulated night inside the Asylum had already been doing to him in a slower, uncontrolled approximation of the same process, is where the next chapter goes. Because the engine at the center of all of this wasn't just a torture device, and it wasn't just a weapon delivery system. It was the physical embodiment of a question that someone had been trying to answer since before Murkoff existed. A question about what human consciousness actually is, and what happens when you push it past every limit it normally operates within. The answer to that question was already affecting Miles before he ever reached the underground level. The Asylum itself, the horror it had accumulated, the psychological extremity of every encounter from Walker's hands through Trager's shears had been doing to him, uncontrolled and without direction, something that the engine was built to do precisely and deliberately. And by the time he reached the door to the lab, the difference between what the engine had manufactured in Billy Hope and what the Knight had manufactured in Miles was smaller than anyone outside the asylum could have known. That's not a comfortable place to be at the edge of a chapter, but it's exactly where the analysis needs to sit before we go further. Because once we understand what the engine did and why Miles was already closer to a viable host than anyone could have planned, the final section of his Knight stops looking like a sequence of obstacles he overcame and starts looking like a path someone had been building for him without knowing his name. Chapter 7: The Engine and What It Made. In 1938, a German scientist produced documentation of an experiment that Berlin classified as sufficiently promising to warrant continued funding. The documentation didn't survive the war in any complete form that reached public records. What survived was the man, and what the man carried in his head, and the specific trajectory of that knowledge across the decades that followed. Rudolf Gustav Wernicke had been working on a question that most serious research institutions would have declined to fund because the question itself was too far outside the borders of accepted science. He believed consciousness was not fully bound to biology. He believed the mind, under specific conditions of extreme stress, could be pushed to a state where its relationship to ordinary physical matter changed. He believed that, at the breaking point of psychological dissolution, something happened that conventional neuroscience had no framework for, and that had, therefore, never been properly studied. To study it, you needed subjects you could push to that breaking point. You needed subjects you could push past it. You needed subjects you could observe at the moment when whatever happened, happened, and the ethical constraints that normally governed research using human subjects were, in Wernicke's institutional environment, not a meaningful obstacle. His primary tool was the morphogenic engine, a process designed to induce extended lucid dream states while simultaneously engineering the psychological content of those states to achieve maximum disorientation and terror. The process drew on detailed knowledge of each subject's psychology, their specific fears and memories and wounds, and used that knowledge to construct internal experiences calibrated to push past every defense the mind could mount. The body remained functional. The mind experienced whatever the engine directed it to experience, sustained past any point at which consciousness would normally find a way to escape. What Wernicke documented was not gradual psychological damage. He documented specific anomalies in subjects who had been pushed past the breaking point, spontaneous physical phenomena that had no conventional biological explanation. His theoretical framework held that at the moment of complete psychological dissolution, when the mind's relationship to its own substrate reached a specific breaking point, consciousness could produce effects on physical matter that circumvented ordinary biological mechanisms. The nanites in his framework were what consciousness produced at that breaking point, molecular-scale machines assembled by the body's own cells, directed by the mind's relationship with the dream state, capable of effects that no conventional technology had achieved. The research was extraordinary, not because it was sound science by the standards of what the scientific community normally recognizes. It was extraordinary because Wernicke had unlimited human subjects and no ethical constraints, and pursued his question past every limit that would have stopped conventional research. And what he found at the bottom of that investigation was something that, however illegitimately produced, appeared to be real. The nanites were real, the effects were real. Murkoff Corporation, decades later, built the infrastructure to reproduce them on an industrial scale. Project Walrider was the operational result of that infrastructure. The specific function of the engine, as Murkoff deployed it at Mount Massive, was to identify minds that could achieve what the documentation calls lateral ascension, the specific cognitive state in which consciousness could direct the nanite swarm through lucid dream control. Most minds couldn't achieve it. Most minds, when pushed past the breaking point the engine was designed to reach, simply broke. The variants were the record of those failures. People whose minds had been dissolved to the point of permanent fracture without achieving the specific integration that would have made them viable hosts. The distinction between a variant and a viable host was, in the project's documentation, the distinction between dissolution and integration. A mind that dissolved when pushed past its limits produced a variant. A mind that integrated at that point, that found a way to organize rather than fragment when pushed into the extremity the engine was generating, could become a host. The Walrider needed not just a broken mind, but a specific kind of unbroken one. A mind that could go all the way to the edge and hold together. Billy Hope achieved this. The documentation notes that he discovered a capacity for self-directed lucid dream states that allowed him to maintain functional coherence while in the engine's most extreme conditions, and through that coherence, he achieved the connection to the swarm that made him the Walrider's first host. What the canon establishes about Billy, before Murkoff acquired him through the transaction with his mother, is relevant here. He had served in the army. He had not manifested documented mental illness. He was not someone who had been broken by life before Murkoff got to him. The thing that made him capable of lateral ascension was not a pre-existing fracture. The documentation of Project Walrider says something important about this. The aim was to find the right mind, and the right mind was specifically one that could find a way to hold itself together under conditions designed to destroy it. The viable host was not a shattered person. The viable host was a person who couldn't be shattered. This distinction matters enormously for the question of what Miles was and why the Walrider chose him when Billy died. Consider what the game documents about Miles's experience across a single night. He was thrown through a window by a man with the strength and mass of a force of nature. He lost consciousness and regained it in a different part of the building, with no memory of the transit. He was captured and physically mutilated while restrained. He watched a man crucify and immolate himself in a ceremony of religious devotion. He was chased through the facility by the Walrider itself, the entity that had been killing tactical military units throughout the night, while trying to reach the one place in the building that could stop it. He found the underground lab and the man suspended in the sphere and the tubes and the chemical bath, and he understood enough of what he was seeing to understand what was being asked of him. He destroyed the life support mechanism. He watched Billy Hope die. He stood in the underground lab as the Walrider, suddenly without a host, assessed its options, and he held together. This is the moment the Doom argument has been building toward, and it's the moment most analyses of Outlast treat as climactic without examining what made it possible. Miles became the Walrider's host at the end of the game not because he was conveniently present at the moment Billy died. The lore of Project Walrider is explicit that not everyone who was present in the facility during the collapse became a viable host. The engine processed many people toward that outcome and failed. Walker's entire campaign of killing was premised on the understanding that host viability was a specific property, not a universal one. If any random person in the building could have hosted the Walrider, Walker's containment strategy would have been mathematically hopeless from the beginning. He was trying to eliminate the pool of viable candidates, which implies the pool had a defined character. Miles was in the pool. The question is why, and the answer builds across everything the previous chapters have established. His professional history had, through sustained exposure to material that pushed most people's capacity for coherent functioning, produced a specific kind of psychological architecture. The trained suppression of self-protective responses, the compulsion to document rather than dissolve, the ability to maintain the narrating self, the observing journalist voice, the pen and camera identity, through conditions that destroyed that capacity in other people. His dark humor in the notes was not detachment. It was the sign of a mind that had found a way to maintain its organizing principle under conditions that should have dissolved it. That organizing principle, the journalist's commitment to bearing witness, was structurally similar to what the engine was designed to produce through deliberate torture. The engine pushed minds until it found the ones that organized rather than fragmented at extremity. Miles's professional life had been doing something functionally similar, more slowly and less deliberately, through the accumulation of exposure to things that others turned away from. The night inside the asylum accelerated that process to its endpoint. Every encounter, Walker's physical brutality, Martin's theological redirection, Trager's surgical violation, the Walrider's own presence in the corridors, The footage Martin showed him of the swarm killing tactical forces, the gradual navigation through a building full of the consequences of what the engine had done to everyone else, all of it together constituted an experience whose psychological intensity was, by the end, comparable to sustained engine exposure. Not identical, not designed, not targeting the specific breaking points of Miles's psychology with the precision Murkoff's process used, but operating in the same direction, toward the same general threshold. By the time he stood in the underground lab and shut off Billy Hope's life support, his mind had been pushed to places that most human minds cannot reach and still report back from. And he was still there, still functional, still holding together. The Walrider assessed available options. Miles was the option available. But Miles was not simply the only person present. He was, by the logic of what the engine's research had established about host viability, the right person. A mind that had traveled all the way through the night's extremity and arrived at the other side still coherent was exactly the kind of mind the swarm could use. Dr. Wernicke, in his wheelchair at the corridor outside the lab, understood this in the moment it happened. His exclamation at the sight of Miles emerging as the new host reflects recognition, not surprise. Someone who had spent his life trying to produce this specific outcome, who had built the machine that was supposed to create it in controlled conditions, recognized the uncontrolled version when he saw it. The irony of Wernicke's presence at that moment carries its own weight. He had designed the engine to manufacture viable hosts through deliberate, systematized horror. Miles had arrived at host viability through a night of unsystematized horror, accumulated across a lifetime of professional exposure to its milder forms. The machine and the man produced, from different directions, the same outcome. Wernicke ordered his forces to fire on Miles. The Walrider killed them. And the question of what happened to Miles after that transition, the question of whether any of his original self persisted inside the host, or whether the Walrider simply occupied the space where Miles had been, is one the lore deliberately leaves without a clean answer. His status in the aftermath is described by Murkoff's own people as neutralized. The word is chosen carefully. Not dead, not confirmed dead, neutralized, which in institutional language means rendered no longer a functional threat or asset in an identifiable form. What Wayland Parks saw when he climbed into Miles's car at the end of Whistleblower was a dark cloud hovering in front of the asylum, and inside it, a figure limping toward the exit. That figure let Wayland leave. More than that, the Walrider that had been tearing apart everyone who stood between the asylum and the outside world actively cleared Wayland's path, killing Jeremy Blaire when Blaire tried to stop him, allowing the one person who could bring Murkoff's crimes into the light to reach a car and drive away with enough evidence to matter. Whatever was inside that swarm as Miles limped toward the exit, it remembered enough of what Miles had come to do to make sure someone finished it. That's the part of the ending nobody talks about, and it's going to be the focus of a later chapter. But first, there's a dimension of the doom argument that this analysis has been circling without addressing directly: the institutional dimension, the question of what Murkoff was actually trying to do with Miles's presence, and whether the corporation that had turned psychiatric patients into research material had already made a decision about the freelance journalist who showed up at their gate. Chapter 8. The Corporation That Needed Someone. Jeremy Blaire never appears in the main game. He's a voice. He's documentation. He's the shape of decisions that have already been made before Miles walks through the fence, and the shadow behind every obstacle the facility deploys against witnesses. In Whistleblower, he becomes visible, and what visibility gives him is not complexity in the heroic sense, but clarity about what kind of thing he actually was. He was Murkoff's executive vice president of global development. He oversaw Project Walrider. He oversaw Mount Massive Asylum. He was the man whose authority shaped what the facility did to the people inside it, and he was completely sane throughout. That last part matters more than it initially seems. Every other significant threat Miles encounters inside the facility is the product of what the engine did to someone's mind. Walker, Trager, Martin, the twins, the variants roaming the corridors, all of them are in their current states because of what Murkoff's process did to them. Blaire was different. Blaire was the process. He made the decisions that produced all of those people, and he made them with full moral agency and full cognitive function and the specific institutional logic of someone whose priority was keeping the project running and the evidence buried. His response to Wayland Park's whistleblowing was to have Park committed to the facility as a patient. The elegance of this response, from Blaire's perspective, is worth examining. Park had sent an email exposing what Murkoff was doing. The email described illegal experimentation on patients. Murkoff's countermove was to make Park a patient. Anything he said about what he'd witnessed could now be attributed to the mental illness that had, in the official documentation, necessitated his commitment. The evidence became a symptom. The witness became the subject of the very accusation he was making. This is a textbook example of what researchers who study institutional abuse call the credibility-destroying loop, the mechanism by which institutions that harm people use the markers of their authority to discredit the testimony of those they've harmed. The doctor says the patient is delusional. The warden says the prisoner is lying. The institution says the witness is mentally ill. The authority of the institution becomes the reason the victim's account cannot be trusted, and the institution that caused the harm is the institution evaluating the harm's legitimacy. Blaire had refined this to an art form. The entire structure of Mount Massive, its official clinical function, its paperwork, its management hierarchy, was a credibility-destroying apparatus. The research that was actually happening inside could be denied because the official purpose of the facility was care. Anyone who said otherwise could be committed to the care facility they were accusing, at which point their testimony carried the epistemic weight of any patient's claims about their institution. Now consider what Miles' arrival meant within this framework. He was a journalist, not an employee, not a patient, not someone Blaire could simply commit under the pretense of psychiatric care. A freelance investigative reporter who had driven alone at night without telling any institutional structure where he was going was, from one angle, the least protected kind of person Murkoff could encounter. No one was tracking his location. No one expected him to check in. His disappearance, if it came to that, would be more difficult to account for publicly than a patient's, but not impossible. Murkoff was practiced at accounting for things. From another angle, though, he was the most dangerous kind of person they could encounter. A journalist without institutional backing had no institutional constraints. He couldn't be fired for the material he produced. He couldn't be supervised or redirected by an editor who had decided the story was too sensitive. His documentation, if he got it out, would carry the credibility of someone who had risked everything personally to obtain it, which in the public information environment carries considerable weight precisely because it's harder to attribute to institutional interests. What Blaire did about Miles is not fully documented in the game's canon. What the events suggest is that the decision-making about Miles was caught between two competing institutional imperatives. On one hand, he needed to be eliminated as a threat before he got out with documentation. On the other hand, if the project needed a new viable host, and if what was happening inside the facility suggested that the existing host situation was becoming unstable, then Miles' specific properties might have made him more interesting as an asset than as a simple liability. The distinction that Project Walrider had established between viable hosts and non-viable ones was known to Blaire. Blaire had overseen the project long enough to understand what made someone a potential host. A freelance investigative journalist who had been fired for Afghanistan material, who had driven alone to a facility in the middle of the night on an anonymous tip, who had the professional history and psychological profile of someone constitutionally incapable of backing away from what he'd come to find. That person had properties that looked familiar if you'd spent years trying to identify viable host candidates. Blaire didn't necessarily need to reach that calculation consciously. The institutional logic of Murkoff, shaped across years of treating every person who entered the facility as either an asset or a threat to be managed, would have arrived at a version of the same assessment automatically. Miles was too useful as a potential asset, and too dangerous as an unmanaged witness to handle through simple elimination if elimination could be avoided. Whether this constitutes Blaire choosing Miles as a host, or simply creating conditions under which the existing mechanisms of the facility would process Miles in the direction that served Murkoff's interests, is the kind of distinction that matters less than the outcome. What happened to Miles inside the facility was consistent with Murkoff's logic about what to do with people who arrived at their door with a camera and a conscience. There's a real-world parallel to this institutional behavior pattern that doesn't require any supernatural elements to land with force. Organizations that conduct activities they know are wrong, and that have developed sophisticated mechanisms for suppressing exposure, consistently demonstrate a specific kind of adaptive intelligence when dealing with potential witnesses. They don't always respond to threats with direct violence. Direct violence creates evidence. Sophisticated institutional actors tend toward more complex responses, discrediting the witness, reframing the nature of the threat, converting the danger into an asset where possible, creating conditions under which the witness becomes part of the story rather than its narrator. Murkoff had been doing this for decades. Every person who knew too much became a patient. Every patient's testimony was categorically discredited by the institution that produced their condition. The entire architecture of Mount Massive was a witness management system dressed in the language of psychiatric care. Miles arrived at that system as someone the system had not originally planned for, but the system adapted, as sophisticated institutional systems do, toward incorporating him rather than simply eliminating him. And the result of that adaptation was the chain of events that the previous chapters have documented, the encounters that didn't kill him, the path that kept leading him deeper rather than out, the specific direction of his night inside the facility. There is a moment in the analysis of institutional behavior where the question of intentionality becomes less important than the question of design. Blaire may or may not have consciously decided that Miles should become a host. What Murkoff had built at Mount Massive was a system with its own momentum, designed to process people toward outcomes that served the project's interests. That system encountered Miles and processed him. Whether any individual within it specifically chose him is almost beside the point. The system was built for exactly this. Here's the piece of this that nobody talks about, the thing buried in how the Walrider's requirements intersect with Murkoff's institutional logic, and it changes the shape of the doom argument significantly. The morphogenic engine was not simply a tool for creating hosts. It was a tool for identifying what properties made a viable host and then engineering a mind that possessed those properties through sustained exposure to calibrated horror. What the project documentation reveals is that Murkoff had been running this process for years, producing variants, refining the methodology, learning from failures, developing an increasingly precise understanding of what distinguished the minds that integrated from the minds that dissolved. By the time Miles arrived, Murkoff understood the viable host profile better than anyone outside the project could have, and Miles, the product of years of professional exposure to exactly the kind of sustained psychological extremity that distinguished integration from dissolution, fit that profile without having been processed by the engine at all. He was a naturally occurring viable host candidate, produced by his own life choices and professional history, shaped by the specific demands of the work he had chosen to do and kept doing despite its costs, arriving at the facility at the exact moment when the existing host was reaching the end of his functional capacity. The coincidence is so precise that calling it a coincidence feels like the wrong word. The institutions that had been building toward this outcome, Murkoff's research program, Wernicke's original theories, the project documentation that described what a viable host looked like, all of it had been converging on a description. And a freelance journalist with a specific professional history had been spending years becoming that description, without any knowledge that the description existed. If that isn't doom, it's something that requires a stronger word. But hold that conclusion for a moment, because there's a version of this argument that treats Miles as purely passive, as someone things happen to, rather than someone who made choices, and that version is incomplete. The most important complication to the doom argument, the one that prevents it from being simply a tragedy of external forces, is what Miles actually chose inside the facility. And what he chose is directly connected to the question of what was still recognizably him when the Walrider chose him. We need to look at the underground lab not as the place where Miles was transformed, but as the place where he made the last decision of his human life, and why that decision, made freely in a situation of maximum constraint, reflects exactly the person his professional history had built him to be. That's where the next chapter goes. First, though, sit with the image of Blaire in the lobby at the end of Whistleblower, wounded, on the floor, positioned as an obstacle between Wayland Park and the exit, deploying his last available resource, the pretense of a deal. He had spent his entire professional career managing people through the manipulation of incentives and the deployment of institutional authority. He had committed, tortured, and supervised the destruction of countless people to keep the project running. And at the end, when the facility had collapsed around him, and the only person left who might still be persuaded was a scarred software engineer limping toward an exit, Blaire tried to use the last tool he had, a deal. The same institutional logic, right up until the Walrider tore it from his hands. The entity that killed Jeremy Blaire was the one Miles had become, and the choice to let Wayland leave, to protect the only person who could bring what had happened to light, was the last visible sign that the journalist who had driven through the night to document something that needed to be known was still present somewhere inside the swarm. We need to examine what that means, which requires going into the underground lab and understanding exactly what happened at the moment the Walrider found its new home. Chapter 9, The Last Human Choice. The underground lab was not designed to be witnessed. Everything above it, the ward corridors and chapel and courtyard and administrative spaces, those areas existed within the logic of a functioning institution, however corrupted that function had become. They had the architecture of a place meant to process and house human beings. The underground lab had the architecture of a place meant to produce something. The distinction is visible in the design. The space below was industrial in a way the upper floors weren't, a facility within a facility, built to contain the specific apparatus of Project Walrider's final phase. The machinery there wasn't medical in any conventional sense. The sphere, the fluid reservoir, the tubes running into the body of a young man, kept in permanent lucid suspension. The life support systems maintaining the minimum biological conditions necessary for consciousness to continue without requiring the host to be conscious in any ordinary sense. None of it resembled the vocabulary of care. It was the vocabulary of manufacture, of production. Billy Hope had been inside that sphere for long enough that the boundary between his body and the apparatus had become unclear. The fluid maintained him. The tubes sustained him. His consciousness, directed inward through the permanent lucid state the engine had cultivated, was the control mechanism for the swarm operating throughout the facility. He was, in the most literal available sense, the Walrider's anchor. Not its source, not its creator, but the fixed point around which the swarm organized its behavior. He was also, from the perspective of what was happening to him biologically and psychologically, beyond rescue in any meaningful sense. This is not a judgment the game articulates directly. It's visible in the design of the situation. The person inside the sphere was not someone who could be extracted and returned to ordinary life. The process that had produced his capacity to host the Walrider had also produced his complete dependence on the apparatus keeping him in the state that made hosting possible. Removing him from that apparatus was not a rescue, it was a transition from one kind of ending to another. Miles arrived at the underground lab guided by the cumulative architecture of his night, by Martin's theology and Trager's operating theater, and the Walrider's own inexplicable choice to chase him toward the lab rather than kill him in the corridors, by the footage Martin had shown him of the swarm, by every event that had pointed him downward rather than out. He arrived having processed things no single night should contain, and he found Dr. Wernicke. Wernicke, in a wheelchair, confined to the physical state that his own age and the years of his research had produced. recognized Miles with the clarity of someone who had been expecting, in some general form, exactly this kind of arrival. He explained, with the directness of a man who understood the situation better than anyone else in the building, that the only way to stop what was happening was to kill Billy, to shut down the life support, to end the Walrider's existing host so that the swarm would lose its anchor. What Wernicke didn't tell Miles, because the canon doesn't give us evidence that Wernicke could have predicted this specific outcome with certainty, is what would happen immediately after. The Walrider without a host doesn't dissipate. The research had established this across years of failed attempts to produce hosts and the observation of what the swarm did when the connection to a controlling consciousness was severed. The swarm needed an anchor. Remove the anchor and the swarm seeks another. The seeking isn't passive. The swarm evaluates available options and selects the one that meets its requirements. Miles, standing in the underground lab at the moment Billy's life support failed, was the available option, and he met the requirements. But before reaching the moment of possession, the moment of choice deserves more attention than it usually gets in analyses of the game. Killing Billy Hope was not presented to Miles as a clearly correct moral action. The situation framed it as necessary, as the only lever available, as the technical solution to the problem of a swarm operating without coherent direction and killing everyone it encountered. Wernicke offered it in those pragmatic terms, and Miles, facing an environment in which the alternative to using the available lever was continuing through a facility that was killing everyone inside it with no endpoint in sight, used the lever. But Billy Hope was a person. He was a person who had been acquired by a corporation through a transaction with his mother, who had been subjected to a process he hadn't consented to, who had achieved something extraordinary through the destruction of everything ordinary about his existence. His consciousness was somewhere inside the swarm, directing it, possibly experiencing something through its operations. The documents aren't completely clear on the phenomenology of what it was like to be Billy. What they're clear about is that he had not volunteered for any of it, that the apparatus keeping him alive was also keeping him captive, and that the man who shut down his life support ended his life in the process. Miles made that choice. He is not a passive figure at this moment of the narrative. He is someone who assessed what was available, understood enough of the situation to know what the action meant, and took the action. The journalist who had spent the entire night as a witness, documenting and navigating and observing without being able to change any of the things he was witnessing, finally had a lever, and he pulled it. That moment of agency, the first real moment of agency in Miles's entire night, is immediately answered by the Walrider. The swarm, suddenly without the consciousness that had been directing it, assessed what was present in the lab. The assessment was rapid. The swarm moved toward Miles and entered him. The documentation of what this felt like from Miles's perspective doesn't exist in the game, because first-person perspective games don't give you interiority beyond what the character shows through behavior, and Miles's behavior at that moment is to collapse and then rise in a different form. What the game shows is the transition from one state to another, expressed through the visual language of the swarm surrounding him and the body moving differently afterward. Rudolf Gustav Wernicke had wanted a viable host. He had the science and the institutional resources of Murkoff behind decades of trying to create one. Now he had one, and his immediate reaction was to try to destroy it. The explanation the whistleblower's epilogue offers is that the Walrider, with Miles as its host, was outside the control parameters that made it useful. Whatever Murkoff had been building toward, a controllable weapon with a controllable host, what they got was a man whose own autonomous psychology was now the organizing principle of the swarm, and Wernicke, who understood better than anyone what the Walrider was capable of, understood that an uncontrolled version of it was the opposite of what the project had been designed to produce. The forces fired. Miles was shot. The Walrider absorbed the impact and responded. What happened to those forces is documented briefly, and not in any detail that requires elaboration here. The point is the outcome. They didn't stop what they were trying to stop. The Walrider moved through them the way it had moved through everything else in the facility that had tried to contain it, and whatever was now inhabiting the space where Miles had been walked toward the exit. Here is where the doom argument reaches its most important complication, the one that prevents the entire analysis from resolving into a clean tragedy about a man destroyed by forces beyond his control. Miles chose to kill Billy. He didn't have to. He could have, in the strictly theoretical sense that all choices exist in theoretical space, refused Wernicke's instruction. He could have decided that shutting off another person's life support was a line he wasn't able to cross regardless of the circumstances. He could have made a different calculation about what the available options were and what the right action was within them. He made the choice he made, and the Walrider took him immediately afterward. The sequence is so tight that it's easy to read as inevitable, as though the choice and the consequence were pre-connected, as though making the choice was what activated the consequence. But they weren't mechanically linked in that way. The Walrider chose Miles because of what Miles was, not because of what Miles just did. The action that freed the swarm from Billy created the conditions under which the swarm could find Miles, but Miles's suitability as a host was established by the long preceding architecture of his history and his night, not by the act of switching off a life support system. What that means is that the person the Walrider entered was already someone who had been shaped over years and then intensively over hours into a mind capable of hosting it. The act of choosing to kill Billy was an expression of that shaping, not its cause. A person who had spent years bearing witness to things others couldn't tolerate, who had survived a night of physical and psychological extremity without dissolving, who had kept the camera running and the notebook open through all of it, and who had finally arrived at a moment where watching and documenting wasn't enough and a choice had to be made. That person made an active choice, and then the swarm found its home in him. The doom and the agency are not separable at this moment. Miles was doomed before he arrived, in all the ways the previous chapters have established, and he was also making choices, real ones with real weight, right up until the moment the transition happened. The doom didn't eliminate the agency. The agency didn't eliminate the doom. Both were operating simultaneously, which is what makes his story genuinely tragic rather than simply horrific. There's a psychological concept worth introducing here about the relationship between fate and character in situations of extreme constraint. Research on people who've been in genuinely inescapable situations, hostage situations, survival scenarios, institutional confinement, consistently shows that what distinguishes the people who maintain psychological coherence isn't the absence of constraint, it's the presence of choice within constraint, the ability to find the available choices, however limited, and make them actively rather than being simply carried by events. Miles found his choices all night. He chose to keep moving instead of collapsing. He chose to document instead of dropping the camera. He chose to cut himself free of Trager's restraints. He chose to use the elevator door as a weapon against his captor. He chose in the underground lab to use the lever Wernicke offered. Every one of these choices was made inside a night of doom. Every one of them was real. The Walrider that emerged from the underground lab was therefore not just Miles's doom. It was Miles's choice, extended into a form neither he nor anyone else could have anticipated. And what that entity did next, in the final visible moments of the game's events, is where the doom argument reaches its most unexpected territory. Because what it did next was finish the job. Chapter 10. The Story That Got Out. Picture what Waylon Park saw from the driver's seat of Miles's Jeep. He'd survived his own night inside the facility. His night had different contours than Miles's, different threats, different encounters, but the same fundamental shape. Someone who had tried to do the right thing, being systematically processed by a machine designed to destroy people who did the right thing. He'd been committed. He'd been subjected to the engine's therapy. He'd been chased, wounded, nearly killed more than once. He'd lost every resource he tried to use to call for help. At the end of it, he'd made it to the main lobby. He'd found Blaire injured and positioned as a final obstacle. Had nearly been killed when Blaire's offer of help converted instantly into an attack. And then the Walrider had arrived. What Blaire experienced in his final moments was the full force of what he had been building toward. Not metaphorically, physically. The entity that had been the project he'd overseen, and the weapon he'd tried to control, arrived as the last thing he ever encountered, and it disposed of him with the same efficiency it had applied to every other obstacle that night. Waylon reached the Jeep. He got in. He looked through the windshield. In the dark in front of the asylum, there was a cloud. A dark, churning mass with the visual character the Walrider had been documented displaying throughout the night. Not quite opaque, not quite solid. The swarm in its assembled, visible form. And inside it, limping toward the exit, there was a figure. The figure let Waylon leave. This is the moment almost nobody gives sufficient analytical weight, because what happens afterward is easy to process as simply the Walrider behaving according to its own imperatives. The swarm surrounds the car, which might have been threatening in any other context, and then the car is through the gate and the facility is receding, and Waylon is on the road with everything he recorded. But the Walrider didn't have to let him leave. The swarm that had been killing tactical forces and facility staff throughout the night was not demonstrating a general policy of nonviolence toward anyone carrying documentation. It had been operating according to a logic connected to its host's psychology, and the logic that produced the outcome of Waylon driving away with his footage was not the Walrider's logic. It was Miles's logic. The journalist had driven to the facility because someone needed to document what was happening and get the documentation out. He hadn't managed that himself. He'd been transformed before he could finish the job. But the thing he had become, the entity that now occupied the space where the journalist had been, made the one decision that would allow the job to be finished by someone else, through someone else's camera, but finished. This is a genuinely strange kind of heroism, and the game doesn't announce it as heroism, which is part of what makes it worth naming. Miles's transformation into the Walrider's host is presented as the catastrophic ending to his night, and in most of the ways endings are measured, it is catastrophic. He didn't get out. He didn't file his story. He didn't get to be the journalist who brought down Murkoff, but the story got out. The story got out because whatever remained of him inside the swarm remembered what he'd come for, and made sure the one available witness reached a car with enough evidence to matter. The connection between what Miles had spent his professional life believing and what the Walrider did in those final moments is the quiet center of the analysis. He believed that bearing witness mattered. He believed that documentation was important even when you couldn't stop the thing you were documenting. He believed that the story needed to get out, that the record needed to exist, that the people being harmed deserved to have their harm acknowledged by the world outside the walls. He didn't get to be the one who brought that record out, but he made sure someone did. Here is where the script reaches the rehook it needs. Because what nobody talks about, the thing buried in how the Murkoff account comics handle Miles's aftermath, changes the shape of everything we've been building toward, and it connects directly to a pattern in how institutions respond to the people who document them. Murkoff's language for what happened to Miles is contained in a single word: neutralized. Paul Marion, one of the mitigation investigators who visited Miles's apartment after the events of the game, responded to a question about his status with the information that he was dead. Marion was unaware, the canon notes, of what had actually happened, of the resurrection the Walrider had produced, of the host transition and what it meant. From the outside, from the perspective of a Murkoff investigator going through the motions of post-incident documentation, Miles was simply another body in the accounting. The Murkoff account's official language was neutralized, not confirmed dead, not alive, not in custody, neutralized. The word performs a specific institutional function that deserves examination because it's not accidental. Institutions that harm people and then face documentation of that harm have a documented pattern of response to the people who survived their harm. They reclassify those people. The witness becomes the patient. The investigator becomes the subject. The person whose testimony could produce accountability is reframed in language that substitutes institutional categories for individual identity. Miles Upshur, journalist, became a neutralized entity in Murkoff's documentation. The man who drove to the facility to expose what was happening there was filed, in the language of the institution he went to expose, as a managed outcome, not a person with a name and a history and a professional purpose, a variable that had been addressed. Research on how powerful institutions handle whistleblowers and journalists who document their wrongdoing consistently identifies this reclassification pattern. The language shifts to remove the moral weight from the person. They become a problem, a complication, a situation to be managed. The institutional vocabulary depersonalizes them, which makes the institutional response to them easier to justify internally. You don't have to account for what you did to a person. You account for what was done about a situation. Murkoff had been doing this throughout the facility's entire operation. Every patient who was committed became a research subject in the documentation. Every staff member who knew too much became a variant in the paperwork. Every visitor who got too close became a neutralized entity in the outcome files. Miles joined a list he had driven through the night to expose. The final irony of his entry onto that list is that it confirmed everything the list was designed to deny. He was evidence of exactly what he'd come to document. But neutralized doesn't mean silenced. This is the piece Murkoff missed, or couldn't account for, or simply couldn't prevent. Wayland Park drove away with footage. The documentation that Miles's camera had gathered throughout the night was still in the physical world, recorded on media that existed independently of what had happened to its operator. The notes Miles had written in his journal were still there. The evidence of what Murkoff had done was distributed across everything Miles had gathered during his time in the facility. The institution that had perfected the art of managing witnesses encountered a situation where managing the witness hadn't managed the documentation, because the documentation had already been separated from the witness at the moment of the transition. Whatever the Walrider was now, it wasn't a journalist with a camera, but the camera's contents existed. The footage existed. The record existed. The Murkoff account comics deal with the aftermath of this, with Murkoff's attempts to contain what Park's leaked documentation had produced, with the ongoing institutional machinery of concealment and reclassification grinding against the evidence that had escaped. The full accounting of what those efforts produced lies outside the scope of this particular analysis. What matters for the question this video is asking is what the escape of the documentation means for the doom argument. Because if doom means destruction without remainder, then Miles's doom was complete at the moment the Walrider entered him. He got out of the car and walked into a building and didn't come out as himself. By any ordinary measure, that's a complete and total loss. But doom in tragedy has a specific relationship with legacy. The figure who is destroyed in the Greek tragic framework is not simply erased. Their destruction produces something that persists. Oedipus's suffering produces the clarification of truth. Antigone's death produces the recognition of what was owed. The doom and its aftermath are not separable, because what comes after is shaped by what was destroyed. What came after Miles is complicated but real. Wayland Park got out with footage because Miles, transformed and in a form that had no professional or institutional identity remaining, protected the only remaining witness. The Murkoff Corporation faced, in the aftermath of the Mount Massive incident, a documentation problem they hadn't been able to fully suppress. The events that Miles had gone to document had been documented not by him, but through the chain of events that his presence set in motion. He didn't file the story filed itself, through a channel he made available. The question of what remained of Miles inside the Walrider after the events of the game is one the lore leaves open with unusual care. His status is marked uncertain. The confirmation of his death comes from a source that the canon explicitly notes was unaware of the full situation. The possibility that something persisted, some organizing element of his psychology maintaining coherence within the swarm, is left as a genuine question rather than a rhetorical one. What the Walrider's behavior in its final visible moments suggests is that something did persist. Not Miles as a continuous personality, not the journalist who drove the Jeep and wrote dark notes and survived Trager's bathroom, but something that carried the essential orientation of who Miles had been. The belief that the documentation needed to get out, that the witness needed to survive, that bearing witness to horror was important, even when you couldn't stop the horror itself. That orientation, expressed in the entity's decision to protect Wayland and kill Blaire and allow the footage to escape, is the last visible sign of what Miles had been. It is, in its own strange and completely unprecedented way, the story getting filed. The journalist who couldn't file the story made sure the story got filed anyway. That's the shape of Miles's doom when you look at it from the far end. Not simply destruction, not simply a man consumed by forces beyond his control. A person who drove into a situation that exceeded every category of experience he had, who survived it through the specific properties of his own psychology, who made real choices inside a night of doom, and who, at the moment of his transformation, used whatever remained of his agency to ensure that the purpose he'd arrived with was served. The doom was real. The purpose was also real. Both ran through him at the same time. There's still more to examine, because what makes this analysis something other than just a character study is the question the next chapters address: whether the doom that ran through Miles runs through a specific category of people who can't stop documenting what others turn away from, and what that means for why certain types of stories attract certain types of people. That's where the analysis opens into territory that's wider than one journalist in one building on one night. And it's where the question of what it means to be doomed by your own purpose stops being about Outlast specifically, and starts being about something the game was examining from the beginning. The pattern Miles represents is not unique to him. The next chapter is about that pattern, where it comes from, what it costs, and why people who fit it keep going toward exactly the kind of situations that should turn them around. But first, hold the image of Wayland sending the footage from inside the asylum. Hold the image of the dark cloud in front of the building and the figure limping inside it. Hold the fact that what was in that cloud, whatever fraction of Miles remained operational inside the swarm, let him go. That moment is the most important thing the game does with Miles's doom, and most analysis walks past it on the way to discussing the horror. It wasn't horror, it was the journalist completing the assignment in the only form available to him. Chapter 11. The Pattern in the People. There is a specific type of person who keeps going into the dark, not in the metaphorical sense that language uses when it talks about persistence or courage. In the literal sense, people who, presented with evidence that a situation is dangerous, who have already experienced that danger personally, who carry the professional and sometimes physical marks of what pursuing certain kinds of stories costs, continue to pursue those kinds of stories. They don't stop. They can't explain in fully satisfying terms why they don't stop. They'd tell you it's about the work, about the importance of the story, about the people being harmed who need someone to document what's happening to them. All of that is true. None of it is the complete explanation. The complete explanation involves something about personality structure that sits underneath the professional rationale, something that was probably present before the career choice, and that the career choice then developed and reinforced until the two became indistinguishable from each other. Research on the psychological profiles of people drawn to conflict journalism, investigative reporting covering institutional violence, documentary filmmaking in war zones, and whistleblowing consistently identifies a cluster of traits that appear across these populations in frequencies that exceed what you'd find in general population samples: high tolerance for ambiguity, elevated sensitivity to injustice, specifically the kind of injustice that operates behind official justification, a relationship with risk that differs from the standard human risk aversion pattern, not in the direction of recklessness, but in the direction of recalibrated threshold. These are people whose internal alarm system for danger has been moved through experience, and probably through something dispositional that existed before the experience, to trigger at a different point than average. They also tend to have a specific orientation toward the gap between what is officially true and what is actually happening. The technical term in the research is epistemic vigilance. the heightened sensitivity to information that doesn't match the institutional account. Most people, presented with official assurances that a situation is fine, adjust their assessment in the direction of those assurances. The people in this profile don't. They experience the official assurance as data requiring verification rather than as a reliable account to be accepted. The gap between what the institution says and what the evidence shows is where they live professionally. Miles had all of these properties. His professional history demonstrates them clearly. He didn't accept the official account of what was happening in Afghanistan to the degree that his organization could live with what he produced. He received a tip that Murkoff's official account of Mount Massive Asylum was inaccurate and drove through the night to verify. His entire career, as far as it can be reconstructed from the lore, was organized around the gap between official narrative and documentable reality. That orientation doesn't come from nowhere. The research suggests it develops through a combination of dispositional factors, early experiences that shape the relationship with authority and institutional claims, and professional socialization in environments that reward exactly this kind of skeptical attention. The exact pathway varies from person to person. What tends to be consistent is that by the time someone with this profile reaches adulthood, the relationship with authority and official narrative is established deeply enough that it functions more like a perceptual style than a deliberate choice. Miles wasn't choosing to disbelieve Murkoff's official presentation every time he encountered it. He was incapable of accepting it without evidence. That's not a decision, that's a character structure. And character structures, unlike decisions, don't respond well to the advice to simply make a different choice. When people who study trauma in journalism and related fields talk about why certain people keep going back to the work despite what it costs them, they identify something that functions almost like an identity fusion between the person and their capacity to witness. The work becomes so thoroughly integrated with the self-concept that stopping the work would require dismantling the self-concept, which the mind resists with the same force it brings to resisting any fundamental threat to its organizing structure. Miles had this fusion to a degree that his professional behavior makes visible. The moment he stopped being an employed journalist, he became a freelance journalist. The firing didn't change the structure, it just removed the institutional wrapper around it, the identity. And the work the identity was organized around persisted through the career disruption, and then through what the work subsequently cost him, and it was operating at full force the night he drove to Mount Massive. He couldn't have stopped being the person who would go into that building any more than Walker could have stopped being the person who would try to eliminate every potential host. Their particular forms of damage and their particular forms of purpose were the same thing, viewed from different angles. Walker's containment obsession was the engine's amplification of an existing protocol orientation. Miles's documentation compulsion was a lifetime's amplification of an existing epistemic and ethical orientation. Both of them arrived at Mount Massive being completely themselves. Both of them, therefore, arrived at their respective dooms. But here's where the Miles case becomes something more specific than a character study about a particular kind of damaged professional. Because Outlast is not simply telling a story about a journalist who got in over his head. The game, through the specific mechanics of what it asks you to do as Miles, is making an argument about what bearing witness costs and what it's worth. You don't fight in Outlast. This is the foundational design decision, the one that critics initially struggled with, and that fans with a specific relationship to the game have always understood. You run, you hide, you document, you carry a camera and batteries, and you keep the record going, even when keeping the record going is the most exhausting possible thing, and the sensible choice would be to put it down and use both hands to survive. The battery mechanic, depleting the camera's power and requiring you to constantly find and install new batteries to maintain night vision, is the game's physical representation of what sustained documentation actually costs. It costs energy. It costs attention that could be devoted to pure survival. It costs every resource the situation keeps trying to claim. And you keep allocating those resources to it anyway, because without the camera you can't see in the dark, and without seeing in the dark you can't document, and without documentation there is no story. And without the story, none of this means anything. That mechanic is a perfect representation of secondary traumatic stress in gameplay form. You're spending resources on documentation that survival logic says should be kept for other purposes. The documentation is simultaneously the only tool that makes survival navigable, and the constant drain on the resources required to survive. You can't stop feeding it. The moment you stop, the light goes out. Miles was living that mechanic in a professional context for years before he arrived at Mount Massive. Every story that required him to push past his own response to the material he was documenting was a battery drain. Every story filed was a resource renewed, the compulsion to keep the light on, to keep the record going, to ensure that what was happening was documented regardless of what it cost the documentarian, was already deeply structural in him when he drove up to the fence. The Asylum didn't create that compulsion. The Asylum pushed it to a place from which there was no return. This is the point where the doom argument and the tribute argument converge, and the convergence is uncomfortable in the way that genuinely honest analysis tends to be. Because if what made Miles doomed was also what made him admirable, and if the admirable thing about him was also the thing that made him the perfect host for something that should never have existed, then the lesson the lore is offering is not simply dark, it's precise in its darkness. It says that the specific human qualities most valuable for certain kinds of work are exactly the qualities that make the people doing that work most vulnerable to specific kinds of destruction. The best witnesses get destroyed by what they witness, not because they were insufficient, because they were sufficient enough to go all the way in. There is a name for this in some research frameworks on moral injury, specifically the injury produced when people are forced to participate in or witness things that violate their core moral commitments. Moral injury is distinct from conventional traumatic stress because its primary damage isn't to the fear response system. Its primary damage is to the meaning-making system, the part of the person that organizes experience into a coherent account of what is right and what is wrong, and how the world they're living in relates to those categories. A journalist who goes somewhere to document institutional wrongdoing and finds that the wrongdoing exceeds every frame they brought to the situation, who is then physically harmed by that wrongdoing, who witnesses atrocities that no professional training prepared them for, and who then participates in an action that ends another person's life, even in circumstances of extreme duress. That person is collecting moral injuries at a rate that the most resilient psychology cannot fully absorb. Miles's notes through the game suggest someone who is containing something very large through the ongoing practice of narration. The dark humor is the most visible symptom of this. Humor as a response to horror is one of the most well-documented cognitive coping mechanisms in the literature on people who work in proximity to death and suffering. It doesn't mean the person isn't affected. It means they've found a way to keep the affect from overwhelming the function. The joke is the exhaust valve. As long as it's running, the engine keeps going. His engine kept going all the way to the end. And what the ending revealed about the engine was that it wasn't a separate mechanism from the doom. The engine and the doom were the same machine, running in two directions simultaneously. People who do this work, the ones who keep the light on, regardless of the drain, deserve something more from our cultural understanding than the simplified narrative of the tragic hero who went too far. What they deserve is what this analysis has been trying to give Miles, an honest accounting of what the work builds in people, what that building costs, and what it makes possible that nothing else would. He made something possible that nothing else would have. The story got out. The company that had been running a facility that destroyed human beings for profit faced an accounting, however incomplete, because of the chain of events his presence set in motion. That matters. It doesn't redeem the doom. Nothing redeems doom. But it places the doom in a context that treats it as something other than simply waste. The question the final chapter addresses is whether any of this had to happen the way it did. Whether, at any point in the long sequence of choices and events that produced the ending, Miles could have made a different choice that would have led to a different place. Whether the doom was truly sealed before he arrived, or whether there were moments where he could theoretically have chosen otherwise. The answer is complicated in ways that the doom argument requires us to be honest about. Chapter 12: Why He Couldn't Turn Back. Every analysis of doom eventually reaches the question of whether it was necessary. The tragic framework, whether classical Greek or modern horror, always presents a figure whose destruction feels inevitable, but whose individual choices appear, in isolated moments, to have been otherwise possible. Oedipus could have stayed in Corinth. Hamlet could have acted sooner. Miles could have, at any of several points in his night inside Mount Massive, made a different choice that might have led to a different outcome. The question is whether that's true in any meaningful sense, or whether the appearance of possible alternatives is an artifact of the way humans narrate sequences of events after the fact, imposing a branching path structure on something that was, given the specific person involved and the specific situation they were in, a single line. Start at the beginning. The most obvious candidate for an alternative choice is the moment in the car. He has the tip, he has the camera, he has the fence in front of him, and the dark building beyond it. The alternative choice is to start the engine and drive back to Washington. But consider what that choice would have required. It would have required Miles to be someone who, presented with credible evidence of serious institutional wrongdoing, decided that going home was the appropriate response. His entire professional history, his firing for Afghanistan material, his transition to freelance rather than to a different field, his response to the tip by driving through the night rather than forwarding it to authorities or colleagues. All of it establishes that he was constitutionally not that person. The man sitting in the Jeep looking at the fence was the product of every choice he'd made before that one, and those choices had produced someone for whom going home was not a genuine option. This is not the same as saying he had no free will. It's saying that his free will had been thoroughly expressed in the choices leading up to that moment, and those choices had shaped him into someone for whom going home was as functionally unavailable as, say, deciding to become a different person on the drive back. The character is the doom. They aren't two separate things. Move forward into the facility. The next candidate for an alternative choice is the moment when Miles makes his first serious attempt to leave, restoring power to the security control room and approaching the main door. This is the point at which Martin intervenes with the sedative. Could Miles have gotten out before Martin reached him? The canon doesn't give us grounds to think he was close. Martin had already disabled the power before Miles restored it, demonstrating both that Martin had the capability to control access to the exit and that he'd been monitoring Miles's movements closely enough to intervene precisely. More fundamentally, the building's architecture and the variant population distributed through it meant that any route outward required navigating exactly the kind of challenges that had already been costing Miles time and physical safety throughout the night. But even if he had reached the door and found a way through, his camera footage at that point contained evidence of serious wrongdoing, but not the specific proof of Project Walrider that would have given the documentation its full weight. He had seen bodies, he had seen variants, he had not yet seen the underground lab or the apparatus that produced those things. The story he could have filed at that point would have been significant. Whether it would have been sufficient to bring down Murkoff's institutional defenses against a corporation with the resources and the experience in managing exactly this kind of exposure that Murkoff had is genuinely uncertain. The journalist in Miles would have known this. The journalist who drove through the night to the story because someone needed to document what was happening there would have understood at the moment of approaching that main door that what he had was not yet what the story required. That understanding didn't require Martin's sedative to keep him moving forward. The professional imperative would have produced the same result. This is the mechanism that makes the doom so difficult to locate at a specific moment. The choices that could theoretically have saved Miles were not available to the person Miles actually was. At every point where an alternative existed in the abstract, the concrete version of Miles, shaped by his history and his values and his professional identity, encountered that alternative and found it wasn't one. The Trager encounter is the most extreme test of this. After escaping Trager's bathroom, having been physically mutilated, having discovered that the person who had been hurting others inside the facility had also been on Murkoff's payroll before the collapse. Miles had the clearest possible evidence that what was happening here was beyond the scope of a normal investigative story. The body was giving him information about the level of threat. The professional mind was processing the threat as evidence for the story, rather than as a signal to leave. He kept going. The capacity that allowed him to keep going after Trager's bathroom is the same capacity that made him capable of hosting the Walrider. The engine that kept him functional through experiences that should have broken the will to continue was the engine that the Walrider required from a host. The doom and the survival mechanism were running on the same fuel, which means the question of why he couldn't turn back doesn't have an answer that locates a single point of failure. The answer is distributed across his entire history. Every decision he'd made that moved him further in the direction of this specific kind of person was a decision that moved him further in the direction of this specific kind of ending. The doom accumulated the same way his professional identity accumulated, gradually, through sustained choices. There's a concept in the philosophy of personal identity that's worth bringing in here, not in its technical form, but in its human implication. The idea that the self is not a fixed entity but a narrative, a story the person tells about who they are by the choices they've made and the commitments they've maintained, means that the question of whether someone could have made different choices is really asking whether a different person could have been in that situation. A fundamentally different person, with a different character structure and different values and a different relationship with risk and with stories, would have made different choices. But that different person wouldn't have been Miles. Miles's doom was, at its deepest level, the consequence of being himself completely. He was as fully himself as it's possible for a person to be. Every choice he made, from the professional decisions that produced his firing, to the solo drive to the facility, to the decision to keep moving after Trager's bathroom, to the final lever pull in the underground lab, was an expression of a coherent and consistent self. He didn't waver. He didn't compromise the essential structure of who he was in favor of survival. He kept being Miles all the way to the moment when being Miles was no longer available as a mode of existence. The doom, understood this way, was not an intrusion from outside. It was the trajectory of a complete life, compressed into a single night, arriving at its logical destination. This is what makes Outlast something more than a survival horror game with a particularly dark ending. The specific shape of Miles's fate, the specific way that his most essential qualities became the mechanism of his destruction and transformation, is a genuinely serious argument about the relationship between character and consequence. It says that the people who are most fully themselves, who have organized everything around a coherent set of values and commitments, and won't abandon those values even when abandonment would save them, those people are not protected from destruction by their integrity. They are, in certain configurations of circumstance, more precisely targeted by it. The Asylum didn't destroy Miles despite who he was. It destroyed him because of who he was, and it made him into something else precisely because of what his being himself had produced in him. Consider, in closing this analysis, the image the doom argument leaves us with. A freelance journalist in his late 20s drives alone at night to a psychiatric facility in the mountains. He has a printed tip on his passenger seat, a camera, fresh batteries. He gets out of the car. He climbs the fence. He walks toward the building with no one waiting for him and no one expecting him back. Inside the building, a man who had been a military police officer is killing everyone he can find in an attempt to prevent exactly the thing that is about to happen. A patient who has constructed a theology around the most powerful thing in the building has decided that this specific journalist is his apostle. A former executive turned variant is about to add to the documentation of what this place does to people in a way no journalist assignment had anticipated. And somewhere in the underground lab, a young man who had been given to a corporation by his mother is keeping a swarm of nanites organized through the ongoing force of his consciousness, not knowing he is running out of time. Every one of these forces was already in motion before the fence was climbed. They had their own origins, their own histories, their own reasons for being exactly where they were. Miles didn't create any of them. He didn't know about any of them. He arrived at a situation that had been building without reference to him, and he was processed by it in ways consistent with what the situation required. And yet, the specific qualities he brought to that fence, the character structure built across years of specific professional choices, the psychological architecture produced by sustained exposure to material that most people couldn't tolerate, the identity fused so completely with the act of bearing witness that stopping was not genuinely available as an option. Those qualities were not incidental to the outcome. They were the outcome's prerequisite. The doom was waiting for someone specific, and the person who arrived was specific in exactly the right ways. Was Miles Upshur doomed before he even arrived? The answer the lore builds across everything from his professional history to the final image of a dark cloud in front of an asylum, with a figure inside it choosing to let the evidence escape, is something more layered than yes or no. He was doomed by who he already was. He was doomed by what the building already contained. He was doomed by the convergence of a corporate project with a theological framework, with a specific kind of mind the swarm could use. He was doomed by the gap between what the tip described and what the building was. He was doomed by his own inability to be anything other than completely himself under conditions designed to dissolve the self. And in the specific and irreducible way that doom and purpose can occupy the same space without canceling each other, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not in the cosmological sense Martin would have claimed. In the character sense, this was the story his whole professional life had been building toward, and he followed it to its end with the same fidelity he had brought to every other story that mattered enough to drive toward at night. The doom was real, the purpose was also real. Both ran through him simultaneously, all the way to the door of the underground lab and through it, and past it, into whatever form existence takes when a journalist becomes a swarm. The camera was still running when he went under, and the footage got out. Some stories survive their narrators. That's not a comfort, but it's the truth.